So in the 2 minutes, I just want to drill this down because,
Sure.
yeah, there was a recommendation, and you talked about the failure to meet the Doha Agreement, but the president disregarded that, ignored that. He disregarded the advice of his DOD and IC and National Security Council. Was there ever an evacuation plan? Did you see, I know there's discussions, did you ever see an evacuation plan?
I did not. The discussions were going on at this high level. The problem was those that would need to actually plan and rehearse it were extremely busy. I think Sergeant Major captured it eloquently of how busy and how few service members we had on the ground. They were not in a position to be able to plan and rehearse.
Now, we've issued several subpoenas. I have not seen an evacuation plan. If they had it, I think they would have produced it to this committee. And this led to the chaos. Who was in charge? You know, we heard Sergeant Tyler Vargas Andrew testify that he had the suicide bomber in his sights, but they didn't know what the rules of engagement were, for God's sakes. I mean, there's no plan. There are, rules of engagement are confusing at best. They don't know what they are. Did you know what the rules of engagement were?
I was not on the ground, so I can't speak to the specific rules of engagement. I know the military had a clear leadership position of who was in charge on the ground. What was lacking, from my perspective, was a Department of State leadership on the ground.
So when I asked who was in charge, if you have an evacuation plan, state takes over the evacuation, correct? Prior to that, the DOD is in charge, but nobody knows who's really in charge because there's no plan in place. And guess what? The Taliban takes over. My last question. The rules of engagement are confusing at best. You had mentioned a defensive strike would be a rule of engagement. If you saw a description of the suicide bomber, along with your sniper team who confirmed this is the suicide bomber, would the rules of engagement provide that you could take out the threat as a defensive strike?
If I saw the suicide bomber and I saw the threat, I would absolutely kill that suicide bomber.
And yet when he contacts his commanding officer who we're going to interview, he says, I don't have that authority. And they ask, who does have that authority? He goes, I don't know. I'll have to get back to you. And in the interim time, guess what? The bomb goes off, killing 13 servicemen and women, 160 Afghans, injuring 45 additional U.S. servicemen and women. Massive. Because one man says you don't have permission to engage. We're going to follow up on that chain, but I think it all results because there's confusion on the ground. Nobody knows what the plan is, and nobody knows who is in charge. Yes, sir.
Sir, if I could just build on that, I think the point that you're making that there's nobody in charge is exactly right. There's nobody functionally in charge of our wars on the ground in theater. So what happens, if I could just draw a quick picture, is we deploy to combat zones in bureaucratic silos. So you've got the president and then National Security Council beneath them, of course. And then you've got these different bureaucratic silos, so it could be DOD, state, aid, the IC with their different silos, and there's nobody in charge of this group on the ground. And had there been somebody in charge of this group on the ground, then what you would have seen is a plan that not only synchronized the military withdrawal, but also the evacuation. So until we get this problem fixed, we actually have somebody in charge on the ground of our wars, we're going to continue to have high risk of these kind of disasters.
I agree. And by law, they're required to come up with a plan, and they did not. And that's the point the chairman's made over and over. And I thank you for indulging me.
Thank you, Chairman.